Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Conservative MP, Owen Paterson, at the centre of a row over lobbying rules, has resigned, saying he will remain a public servant outside the cruel world of politics. His decision came after the government was forced into a major U-turn today over proposed changes to the way MPs are reprimanded for breaking the rules. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, reports.
Can you take a step back?
A different kind of protest.
We're just going to check and protect.
A different kind of attack to Green activists busy in Westminster today.
Come down here.
Sorry.
Sleaze is the accusation against the government. Corruption, the claim. A former minister has now quit as an MP after he was found to have lobbied the government more than a dozen times for companies who paid him thousands of pounds. Standing down, Owen Paterson said, "My integrity has been repeatedly and publicly questioned. I maintain that I'm totally innocent. My children have asked me to leave politics altogether, for my sake as well as theirs. I agree with them. I will remain a public servant, but outside the cruel world of politics."
The ayes to the right, 250.
But Downing Street had tried to save him.
232.
Tories last night voted to tear up the rules he broke. But listen to the atmosphere in there.
Order!
What have you done to this place?
Dozens of Conservatives, outraged, stayed away.
It would be terrible.
But Number 10 had backed the attempt to overhaul the system that monitors behaviour that would have saved him. The immediate backlash was bruising, nearly all of the front pages damning, the internet alive with claims of sleaze, political rivals immediately sharpening attacks. Many Tories, too, were appalled.
Leaves of the House. Thanks.
So by mid-morning, ministers were back in the Commons, ditching the idea, and in effect, ditching Owen Paterson too.
Last night's vote has created a certain amount of controversy. It is important that standards in this House are done on a cross-party basis. While there is a very strong feeling on both sides of the House that there is a need for an appeals process, there is equally a strong feeling that this should not be based on a single case or applied retrospectively.
In other words, changing the rules that Mr Paterson broke is off for now.
So what's your reaction to what's happening?
But the opposition says it's a wider pattern.
Corrupt. I mean, there's no other word for it, I'm afraid. And often in a situation like this, you have a Prime Minister who is trying to lead on public standards. What you've got with this Prime Minister is a Prime Minister who is leading his troops through the sewer. And so it is a complete mess of their own making.
It's a very strong accusation to say this is corrupt.
Well, it is corrupt because there was a clear finding after due process.
Boris Johnson says he's sorry to see Mr Paterson go, but outrage at how the Prime Minister tried to use Parliament will take time to fade.
And I think it's fair to say tonight that these shenanigans have backfired pretty spectacularly, not just meaning the end of Owen Paterson's political career, but also stirring up questions about what Downing Street was really trying to achieve here and the Prime Minister's own attitude to following the rules. And with a by-election now beckoning and the opposition parties, of course, keen to make the most of what they see as a political opportunity, I don't think for a single second we've heard the last of this yet.
Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, thank you.
The Conservative MP at the centre of the Westminster lobbying row quit today, saying he'd wanted a life outside the cruel world of politics. Owen Paterson, who has represented North Shropshire for 24 years, said the last 2 years had been an indescribable nightmare and that his children had asked him to step down. Paterson was found to have broken lobbying rules and was facing suspension until Conservative MPs blocked it in an extraordinary intervention yesterday. That prompted a huge backlash, forcing the government into a sudden, humiliating U-turn over its plans to change the way MPs are policed. And the fallout from the row is unlikely to settle for some time. From Westminster, here's John Ray.
Judged guilty of the most serious breaches of Parliament's lobbying rules. But now, neither the Commons nor the voters will decide Owen Paterson's fate. He has quit as an MP, leaving chaos in his wake, protesting his innocence to the end.
I hope no other MP goes through the horrors that I and my family have been through for the last...
It was fighting talk, followed today by regret and resignation. My integrity, which I hold very dear, has been repeatedly and publicly questioned, he said. I am unable to clear my name under the current system. I will remain a public servant, but outside the cruel world of politics.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the left, 232.
24 tumultuous hours began with a contentious vote to scrap the rulebook by which MPs police their own behaviour, to hand Mr Paterson a controversial reprieve and to provoke a furious backlash.
In my view, yesterday's vote on the report of the Common Standards Committee was a very serious and damaging moment for Parliament and for public standards in this country. This extraordinary proposal is deeply at odds with the best traditions of British democracy.
Are the Tories the party of sleaze, Prime Minister?
The U-turn was rapid, and for Boris Johnson, whose personal authority was at stake, chastening.
While there is a very strong feeling on both sides of the House that there is a need for an appeals process, there is equally a strong feeling that this should not be based on a single case or applied retrospectively. I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern.
It was a monumental climb down.
It's no wonder that this morning they're waking up and asking themselves what on earth they've done, because what they've done is corrupt. And often in a situation like this, you have a Prime Minister who is trying to lead on public standards. What you've got with this Prime Minister is a Prime Minister who is leading his troops through the sewer.
Tonight, the Prime Minister paid tribute to Mr Paterson, calling him a distinguished friend and colleague for decades. But what will remain after his departure? The memory of personal misfortune or the whiff of political scandal with wider reputations at stake? John Ray, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, our political editor, Robert Peston's here. So just how damaging is it, Robert?
Well, it's certainly incredibly embarrassing for the Prime Minister, and many would say damaging on two counts. First, we had that spectacle on Tuesday and Wednesday of the Prime Minister and his chief whip apparently trying to gerrymander the disciplinary system so that one of their colleagues, Owen Paterson, would somehow get off the hook despite being found guilty by the House of Commons' own disciplinary process of breaching the rules on lobbying in a way that was described by the relevant committee as the worst example they'd ever seen. But then, because of the extraordinary uproar from opposition parties, from the media, from former officials, this U-turn. So, you know, the new perception is they're not even very good at it. It's sort of incompetence as well as what some people would describe as sleaze. Now, the other thing that we're left with is a system that many people no longer have confidence in, but no way to reform it so that that confidence can be restored.
OK, Robert, thank you.
So the MP at the very heart of the debate over parliamentary ethics rules has resigned. Owen Paterson had been found to have committed an egregious breach of lobbying rules. The Conservative MP for North Shropshire found the ruling, and many of his Tory colleagues, including Boris Johnson, backed him last night, voting to put his suspension on hold. But earlier today, Boris Johnson U-turned, promising a new vote on Mr Paterson's suspension and a cross-party approach to any reform of parliamentary standards procedures. Paul McNamara has this report.
Well, can I say to you, Mr Speaker...
Listening on as his fate was debated, surrounded by colleagues Owen Paterson had sat beside for 24 years, and a plan backed by the Prime Minister.
Thanks to the effort of my colleagues and the government, we now have a chance to build a proper system based on the rules of natural justice.
That natural justice replaced, less than 24 hours later, with a farewell to the, quote, cruel world of politics, as, with much sadness, the former Cabinet Minister resigned. For 5 years, Mr Paterson earned more than £100,000 a year on top of his MP salary by consulting for 2 firms. Last week, the Parliamentary Standards Committee ruled he had lobbied for these firms in a, quote, egregious case of paid advocacy. Yesterday, instead of voting on whether to suspend Mr Paterson from Parliament, MPs were voting on whether to overhaul the investigations process.
The issue in this case is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal.
The ayes to the right, 250.
This Conservative plan may have won yesterday's battle, but it began a war that they would lose in less than a day.
Do you not feel even a tiny bit grubby doing this?
I really don't.
The case of Owen Paterson really highlighted this sort of anomaly.
But just 2 hours later this morning, a U-turn on a supposed cross-party solution to standards investigations that had no cross-party support.
Therefore, I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases.
And if there was any doubt this was a U-turn, this. Last night, Junior Minister Angela Richardson tweeting she'd been fired for not voting with the government. This morning, reinstated. Yesterday, 248 MPs came through here and voted for a plan backed by the Prime Minister. Many of them told us they weren't comfortable with it and they knew it would look bad to the outside world. Tonight, there is anger, particularly among the newer 2019 intake of Tory MPs, some of whom have told us that they held their noses and voted reluctantly because the party machine told them they had to. One MP told us they received a week's worth of angry emails in just one night.
Well, my office, unfortunately, was vandalised this morning. Tory sleeves painted all over it.
The fallout was foreseeable, says this veteran MP, which is why he wanted a change to how investigations are handled, but says it was foolish to link it to Owen Paterson's case.
It's not been a great 24 hours for the government because, unfortunately, they laid a motion in the House of Commons that conflated two things and asked MPs to vote on it, and that was not bright. We should have dealt with the case of Mr Owen Paterson first and then sought cross-party support for reforming the system.
Owen Paterson strenuously denies any wrongdoing and says he always acted with integrity. Some in his North Shropshire constituency today disagree.
I've just heard today that he's resigned and I'm very pleased about it.
Why are you pleased about it?
Well, I think it should be fair ruling, not one rule for one and one for another. I think what he did was underhanded and it shouldn't be overlooked.
I'm not Conservative. I vote for Labour, to be honest, but he's a good man.
It's not responsible, it's not fair with you know, he's supposed to be running a constituency and it's not okay. You know, to be creaming money from elsewhere whilst he's getting paid for doing one job. It's not okay.
In less than 24 hours, the sun set on a political career that lasted 24 years. The damage to Owen Paterson's career has been terminal. The bigger question, what impact for the party and the Prime Minister that backed him?
Well, shortly before we came on air, I spoke to the former Conservative Deputy Prime Minister, Lord Heseltine. I began by asking him how much damage he thinks has been done to the party over the past 24 hours.
This is a terrible event. It's a human tragedy for Owen and, of course, his late wife, his family, but it is also at the heart of the accountability of parliamentary democracy and the standards that we have got to ensure are preserved if public respect is to be maintained.
But there are two issues in play here. I mean, one is that of an MP taking money to lobby on behalf of two corporations. And the other, of course, is the attempt to ignore the parliamentary commissioner in her findings.
Well, we cannot possibly defend the use of parliamentary privilege for personal gain. That is something that is of critical importance that we do not tolerate if we are to maintain the respect of parliamentary government. The reputation of members of parliament is an essential feature of the quality of our constitution. The only question now is what next? And the critical thing is to have a system of scrutiny which commands respect within parliament, across the parliamentary divides, and in the wider British public.
Well, now you've been, at the top of British politics for a very long time. How much damage do you think this has done the party?
It will certainly have done a considerable amount of short-term damage. But in the end, when you get to general elections, basically the management of the economy, people's sense of well-being, is what determines defeat or return of the existing government. And we're quite a long way off the general election. So I think it would be inaccurate to say that this will be a defining moment for the general election, but it's certainly in the short term a damaging event.
And Boris Johnson is safe as Prime Minister?
I think that he's got these appalling dilemmas facing him. The effects of COVID, the disaster of Brexit, and the responsibilities for the environmental challenges which are being thrashed out in Glasgow. I don't think it's conceivable that a British Prime Minister should disappear in the context of these three enormous challenges.
Lord Heseltine, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, I've been speaking with the former chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, Sir Alistair Graham. I asked him how much damage has been done to the reputation of Parliament.
Well, we'll have to see, but I'm sure there's been considerable damage to the reputation of the Prime Minister in the way that this issue has been so badly handled. And I think a large number of Conservative MPs must be terribly upset in the way they've been led up a hill and back down again.
You were chairman of the Commission on Standards in Public Life. What do you make of the way the incumbent in the House of Commons has performed?
My own view of Catherine's approach to standards is that she's rather cautious and will only proceed if the evidence supports proceeding in a particular way. So it looked like a complicated and nasty manoeuvre to try and get rid of her and get rid of the standard system.
Is there not now a genuine need for a complete overhaul in the way this all works?
Well, the obvious conclusion that you might have of this current scandal is that you should take disciplinary matters away from members in Parliament and have it dealt with by an outside body in the way that doctors, accountants, and a whole range of other professional people have their disciplinary matters dealt with. I suspect in reality there will not be any dramatic changes to the existing system. And of course, I'm not sure that Johnson was terribly worried about that.
Sir Alistair Graham, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
OK.
Owen Paterson has resigned and the government has U-turned over the lobbying row. How did it all happen? Also tonight. As COP26 deliberations continue, next week thoughts turn to the future of transport. But are electric cars really the silver bullet? We ask BMW. And life as Amanda Knox. We speak exclusively to the woman jailed and then cleared over the murder of British student Meredith Kircher 14 years ago.
A lot of people think of me not really as a human being, but as an idea of a person, as like a tabloid entity that they can sort of constantly refer back to without actually engaging with as a real human being.
Good evening. It started as a story about a former cabinet minister facing a month's suspension from the House of Commons for breaking lobbying rules. It morphed into a government attempt to completely overhaul the system governing MPs' standards. And today it ended with a huge government climb down. A climb down that prompted Owen Paterson to quit as an MP, and one that raises questions about the judgment of a Prime Minister who 24 hours ago was tearing up the rulebook, but today came to the realisation that hitching Mr Paterson's case to changing the rules might not look so good in the eyes of the public. To try and make sense of it all, Nick Watt is here. Nick, tell us, I suppose, what's led to this and how we've got to this position.
Well, there's real anger amongst Conservative MPs at what they regard as a cack-handed number 10 operation, and they say this is taking the party back to the sleaze image of the 1990s. Now, Boris Johnson ran into trouble because he made a strategic error and he made a tactical error. His strategic error is his view is he can ride out these furore because he regards them as noise. In other words, that's beltway shenanigans, and the electorate tune out of that. They're only interested in delivery. That is often the case until they tune in. And then he made a tactical error. The whole heart of their sort of reform plan was to set up a cross-party committee that was going to look at a new way of investigating complaints into MPs. Now, they didn't clear that with the Labour Party, so it fell apart. Now, fingers are being pointed at the Whip's office for doing that, but I do have to say I'm rather detecting a mood on that side, thinking this is another fine mess you've got us into, Prime Minister.
And you've got some news this evening.
Yes, senior figures in Parliament are telling me that this could have ended up much, much worse. So the Speaker called that Conservative backbench amendment. It was passed, and what that basically did was that it put the consideration of the report into Owen Paterson on hold until this new system was in place. But crucially, the report was still alive. Now, the Speaker called that backbench amendment because it was in scope. But I understand the authorities were aware that had the Speaker not done that, then Conservative MPs would have voted down the original government motion, which, of course, the government was then not supporting because they were supporting this amendment. Had they done that, that would have killed the report. It would have ended any sanctions against Owen Paterson, and one senior figure told me that would have really brought Parliament into disrepute. So quite a dramatic 24 hours in Westminster. A show of political force yesterday with firm instructions to his MPs on how to vote. Weakened after pushback from his troops. Then today, a hasty retreat. And finally collapse. Owen Paterson resigned after Number 10 decided that a vote would, after all, be held on suspending him from Parliament after he was found in breach of rules on paid lobbying.
Look, Owen has made his statement, and I'm sure you've seen it. I think there have been very sad circumstances.
Personal sympathy from a political soulmate, hours after he had removed support.
Mr. Speaker, I'm also aware that last night's vote has created a certain amount of controversy.
An overwhelming backlash from its side persuaded the government to move and to abandon initial plans to overhaul the system for investigating complaints against MPs.
I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern. This link needs to be broken. Therefore, I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases.
This has been a messy 24 hours for Boris Johnson after Number 10 spectacularly misjudged the mood on its benches. A total disaster driven by Boris Johnson, one of his most loyal MPs told me. And a parliamentary grandee chipped in to say, we have just witnessed an almighty car crash caused by the arrogance of this Downing Street. Tory MPs are questioning Number 10's political operation after they were barely consulted, and a core part of the government plan, a cross-party committee to draw up changes to the complaint system, fell apart because there was no Labour buy-in.
I think there will be others. I don't know what the Labour...
That does not bode well for a new bipartisan push by the government, according to the Labour chair of the existing Standards Committee.
My guess is that the Labour Party will not take part in any of those cross-party talks because there is a cross-party body. It's called the Standards Committee, which is elected by the House. It has 7 lay members on it, and that is the right place for us to consider this matter. We're very close to producing a report, in fact. And I hope that we'll be able to do that before Christmas, and then the House can consider in full the various different options. So there are pros and cons in all of this. We're already considering it in my committee. We will do our job diligently, as we have done in this case. And I just wish the government hadn't driven straight into the quagmire without any consideration or even ringing me.
No, and I think it's a very sad day.
Whitehall Watcher says there are lessons for Downing Street.
I think what's extraordinary is that actually it's almost like a legacy of the Brexit years, where for a long time we said that the government was failing to understand how to work as a minority. Now it seems almost like they're still governing as a minority when they should be thinking as a majority government, and that's about building coalitions over time. It's about listening to your party, it's about foreseeing trouble, and it's also about trying to avoid crisis moments, not looking for moments when to bring everything to a head, not looking for battles that you can win, and also avoiding chaos. And you know, that is a phrase that Dominic Cummings, his former advisor, has particularly directed at the Prime Minister.
It's one of those things.
An ally is sorry to see Owen Paterson go.
I'm sad that he's felt he had to resign. I've only heard this news about 30 seconds ago. He does feel that he's not had a chance to clear his name. You know, in other circumstances, he would have been able to go to the courts and appeal a decision. So it's very sad that he's felt he's had to do this. But he's been through just the most awful experience with the suicide of his wife, and I can understand why somebody would want to say, well, enough is enough.
An unsettled mood in Parliament as friends mourn the departure of Owen Paterson. But many Tories fear Boris Johnson has slipped up and Labour senses an opportunity.
I'm joined now by Conservative MP Richard Graham, who voted for the government amendment yesterday, and Shadow Cabinet Member Labour's Wes Streeting. We did invite the government on, but were told no one was available. Richard, if I could talk first to you and get your reaction to Owen Paterson's resignation.
I think, Emily, that what he's done is the right thing for him, his family, for all of us in the Conservative Party and for Parliament. So although it's been a pretty difficult 24 hours, I think the conclusion that he's arrived at is the right one, and that brings most of this unfortunate episode to an end.
Why on earth is it the right thing for the party? Because surely by the government performing this U-turn, you, your colleagues, the government, you've made it worse for him and his family. Shouldn't you just let the process run its course?
So I think the process would have run its course. When I voted last night, I was always confident that the Standard Committee's report would come back to Parliament for a vote, one way or the other. But it would have taken time. And I think during that time, it would have been agonising for Owen and his family. It would have been very uncomfortable for all of us. And I don't think delaying it would have achieved anything. So that's why I think...
Yes, that's my exact point. You have created the circumstances in which there's now a government U-turn, or rather your leader has, and that's made it even worse, stoking more accusations of Tory sleaze onto your colleague's head.
I'm not sure that that's right. I actually think that it would have been very difficult for Owen to have reached the decision he did 24 hours ago. And therefore, I think, in a way, events have shaped things. And I don't think any of us should underestimate the significant sort of emotion that colleagues felt about trying to give someone support whose wife had committed suicide, try to give him a chance for an appeal in a process that currently doesn't allow it.
I'm not denying that in any way, shape or form, but you're missing my point. I don't know if deliberately or perhaps I'm not explaining myself. I'm talking about the U-turn today. I'm not talking about yesterday. I'm talking about your Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, not sticking with his original course of action. Let me put it to you differently so I can be crystal clear. What exactly happened between 8:10 this morning, when the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, was on the Today programme with my colleagues on Radio 4, and then 2.5 hours later, Jacob Rees-Mogg was sent out into the Commons to say what we did yesterday was wrong?
Well, look, I'm not speaking for the government, and I don't know exactly what happened, but my belief is that everything changed really yesterday evening when the opposition parties made it clear that they would not participate in the Select Committee. That meant that effectively the amendment was dead, and therefore the issue remained about how would the Standard Committee's report be treated. And inevitably, it would mean that it had to come back to Parliament. And at that stage, it couldn't be whipped. It would have to be a vote by MPs.
Yes, but we're nowhere near that. Sorry, you've just blamed the about turn on the government, on the Labour Party. I'll come to the Labour Party in just a moment.
I'm not blaming I'm just trying to explain what happened.
Yes,
and why actually, for many of us,
there's a key
this
thing
was actually a good result.
Sorry, I don't feel that would be necessarily how the public would characterise this. Let me go again. You've just said it's because the Labour Party wouldn't put any MPs on that panel. Why on earth didn't someone from the Prime Minister's team check in advance of putting that forward?
I agree. I totally understand that.
So what are we meant to make of the Prime Minister's judgment?
I think the important thing is, look, what's happened is that we have a situation now where the Member of Parliament involved in the particular report has resigned. So that issue is now over. The second part of the equation is about whether the current process is the right one going forward.
You're not answering my question, which is about actually sorry, you're moving it on. What I'm asking about is the judgment of the Prime Minister in taking that call yesterday without consulting with Labour. Let me go to Labour if I can. Wes Streeting, very aware of certainly of what Richard Graham is talking there with regards to Owen Paterson and the circumstances of that. In his resignation statement, he said, worst of all, was seeing people, including MPs, publicly mock and deride his wife's death and belittle their pain. I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer that. Are you aware of any Labour MPs doing that in the House?
No, and I was in the chamber yesterday for Prime Minister's questions and for the beginning of the debate on the Standards report. You would have to have a heart of stone not to have compassion for Owen Paterson, given the circumstances in which his wife has tragically died. Despite all of the rancour and all of the sleaze of the last 24 hours, on a human level, our hearts go out to him. There's no question of that. What this is about is a Prime Minister who marched his MPs through the voting lobby to corrupt a process which is about upholding a standard in public life so basic that it has existed for hundreds of years, which is MPs do not get paid to lobby for private interests. We're there to work for our constituents. And for Boris Johnson to try and rewrite the rules in the way that he did, once again shows a Prime Minister who thinks it's one rule for him and his mates and another for everyone else.
Do you know what,
and what he has done is just surrounded his party in sleaze, but also threatened the reputation of Parliament.
I think it's very important to not forget what happened when Labour was in charge. 20 years ago, the party of government, as it was, Labour, didn't like the watchdog either. Can I refresh your memory? Events in 2001, the Labour Party exerted pressure to have Elizabeth Filkett, who was then the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, removed from her post. Isn't it just a situation that we really do have, that those who are in power do not like being policed?
No, I don't think that's fair. I mean, I was 18 years old in 2001, but let me tell you about the Labour
I'm
Party
sure
we
you're
have
a follower
today.
of politics,
Look, this is the choice, right, that people have got looking in on this, and I think people across the country are looking in on this. Are you going to continue to give licence to a Prime Minister who is complicit in giving the green light to grubby sleaze and corruption, who shows time and again a lack of respect for basic standards of decency in public life and basic integrity in politics? Or are you going to choose a Prime Minister who is not only a person of integrity, but as Director of Public Prosecutions, literally put expenses cheats behind the bars?
No, hang on a minute. You wanted to talk
about the past a minute ago, but I'm talking about Keir Starmer's record of literally having MPs who were expenses cheats locked up. That's the kind of leadership we need in number 10. That's the kind of integrity we need at the heart of government.
Are you going to support, to Richard Graham's point, are you going to support an appeal being added into the system?
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what Chris Bryant's cross-party standards committee comes forward with, which has lay members from outside politics. I think that's the right thing to do. But let me also just say, it was totally predictable that we wouldn't be complicit in a grubby, corrupt process. You know, you didn't need to be, a sleuth to work out that would happen. And as usual, by the way, let me just make this point. As usual, the government don't put people on Newsnight because they always want to avoid scrutiny. I've lost count of the number of times I've come on as a shadow minister or shadow cabinet minister up against a Tory backbencher because the government don't put ministers on. And once again, it shows their contempt for the voters and the contempt for accountability.
Thank you for your time, Richard Graham. Thank you for yours.